All right, so let's rewind the clock a bit back to the year 2000.
Okay.
You've got the dot-com bubble about to burst. Y2K fears are still kind of, swirling around,
Yeah.
and everyone's feeling like the future is this big unknown thing.
Right.
And right in the middle of all of that, Radiohead drops Kid A.
It's true. And what's so fascinating is that it wasn't just an album. It
Yeah.
really was this cultural moment that captured all of the anxiety of that time.
Yeah, it wasn't your typical, like, guitar-driven record either.
Not at all.
And critics initially hated it.
They did, really hated it. We're talking awful, a wank. Some even said that the band had lost their minds.
Yeah, some seriously harsh reviews.
Uh-huh.
And yet it went on to become one of their most successful albums, like topping the charts and
Yeah.
resonating with a huge audience.
Absolutely. It's incredible. It's really a testament to how much it connected with people.
Totally. So you've given us a really interesting mix of material to unpack for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Articles, reviews, even a Radiolab episode.
Oh, yeah.
All focused on Kid A and its impact.
It's a great selection.
So our mission, I guess, is to figure out why this album, that initially seemed so jarring and strange, ended up connecting so deeply with people.
Right.
And what that tells us about how we deal with uncertainty and change even today.
Exactly, because those themes are still so relevant.
Okay, so before we jump into the music itself,
Yeah.
let's set the stage a bit. Think back to the late 90s, early 2000s.
Okay.
We've got the internet rapidly changing everything, this unease about technology and what it means for the future.
Yeah, and this is where the idea of liquid modernity comes in.
Okay.
It's a term coined by the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman,
Hmm.
and he argued that technology was evolving so rapidly that culture couldn't keep up. It's like the ground was constantly shifting beneath our feet, Like, think about how quickly technology becomes obsolete. Your old cell phone, that clunky computer you used to have,
Right.
that feeling of things changing faster than we can grasp them, that's liquid modernity.
I see. And Radiohead themselves were also in this unique position, right?
Yeah.
They'd just come off the massive success of OK Computer,
Huge success.
but were reportedly burnt out from touring, feeling the pressure to repeat that sound.
Right, it's like classic dilemma, play it safe or take a risk.
Yeah.
And Radiohead, they chose risk in a big way.
They basically said, forget OK Computer 2, we're going in a totally different direction.
Exactly, they completely reinvented themselves.
They stripped their music down,
Yeah.
started experimenting with electronic sounds and instruments, creating something that was unsettling, but also strangely beautiful.
It was a bold move.
Yeah, and, even the band's own label was reportedly confused when they first heard Kid A.
Oh, I believe it.
Yeah.
It was that much of a departure from what they were known for.
That's wild. Okay, so let's talk about those brutal reviews for a minute. Can you give us a sense of what critics were saying at the time?
Yeah, well, some just straight up hated it,
Yeah.
Called it pretentious, unlistenable. Others said they missed the guitars, the more traditional rock sound that Radiohead was known for. It's like they wanted more Creep and Paranoid Android.
Right, like just the hits.
Yeah, exactly.
It's wild to think that an album now considered a classic was initially met with such hostility.
It really highlights that disconnect between critics and the audience sometimes.
For sure.
Because Kid A debuted at #1 in the US.
Wow.
It clearly tapped into something that the critics were missing.
Yeah, so what was it about Kid A that resonated with people in such a powerful way?
Well, one theory is that the album gave a voice to that underlying anxiety that a lot of people were feeling at the turn of the millennium. That liquid modernity, we talked about the rapid pace of technology, the fear of the unknown, all those anxieties were swirling around, and Kid A just captured them perfectly.
It's like the album wasn't just reflecting those anxieties.
No.
It was processing them, trying to make sense of them through sound.
Exactly. And Radiohead weren't afraid to explore the darker, more uncomfortable aspects of that era. And in doing so, they created something that was both unsettling and profoundly moving for listeners.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting, though, because, Kid A, it isn't just doom and gloom.
Right.
It's also about, finding hope and beauty amidst all that chaos and uncertainty.
You're right. There is a kind of strange beauty to it, even in its most unsettling moments.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes the album so compelling. It's not just about wallowing in anxiety. It's about finding a way to move through it, to find meaning and connection despite it all.
Okay, so where does the music itself come into play with all of this? Like, how did Radiohead actually translate these complex emotions and ideas into sound?
Well, one way was by completely like rethinking their approach to songwriting. They
Okay.
incorporated a lot of electronic instruments and techniques that they hadn't really used before.
Like what?
Things like synthesizers, drum machines, and even computers.
Okay, so they're bringing all this new technology. How did that change their sound?
Well, it allowed them to create these incredibly layered and textured soundscapes that were completely different from anything they'd done before.
Mm-hmm.
Like, take Everything in Its Right Place, the opening track.
Okay.
It starts with this repeating hypnotic piano loop and then layers on these shimmering synthesizers
Hmm.
and Tom York's processed vocals, creating this feeling of being swept away by something vast and unknowable.
It's almost like you're being pulled into this digital current.
Exactly. And that feeling is amplified by the lyrics, which are fragmented and often abstract,
Yeah.
but hint at themes of isolation technology and the breakdown of communication.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by how they use York's vocals on Kid A.
Right.
They're often distorted or manipulated, making them sound almost inhuman at times.
That's a really good point. It's like his voice becomes another instrument in the mix,
Yeah.
blending in with the electronic textures and adding to that overall sense of unease and alienation. It's almost like he's becoming one with the technology that's shaping the world around him.
That's interesting. Speaking of technology, Radiohead was one of the first bands to really embrace the internet in the early 2000s.
Oh, absolutely. They were way ahead of the curve.
In what way?
Well, they released a series of short films online to accompany Kid A,
Oh, wow.
and even made the album available for download before its official release.
It's like they understood that the music industry was changing and they were actively shaping those changes.
Exactly. They saw the potential of the internet to connect with their fans in a more direct and intimate way,
Mhm.
and they weren't afraid to experiment with new forms of distribution.
And those short films are really fascinating too. They're almost like mini art pieces in themselves, full of these strange, surreal images that complement the music perfectly.
Right. It's like they were creating this whole multimedia experience around Kid A,
Yeah.
using the internet as a canvas to explore these complex themes and ideas in new and innovative ways.
So we've got this groundbreaking album that captures the anxieties of a generation, pushes creative boundaries, and sounds like nothing else before.
What's the legacy of Kid A?
Well, it's gone on to be considered one of the most influential albums of the 21st century.
Yeah.
It's inspired countless artists to experiment with electronic sounds and push the boundaries of popular music.
Yeah, you can definitely hear its influence in so much music that came after it.
Absolutely. And I think it also helped to legitimize electronic music as a form of art.
How so?
Well, before Kid A lot of people saw electronic music as just dance music or something you'd hear in a club.
Right.
But Radiohead showed that it could be so much more than that it could be complex, emotional, and intellectually stimulating.
It's like they took the genre that was often seen as cold and impersonal and infused it with human emotion and vulnerability.
Exactly. And in doing so, they created something that was both innovative and deeply moving, something that continues to resonate with listeners all these years later. Yeah, it really is amazing to think about how Kid A has held up over time. And in a way, it feels even more relevant now than it did back in 2000.
I think that's absolutely true. So much of what Radiohead was exploring on that album, the unease with technology, the feeling of information overload,
Mhm.
the search for meaning in a rapidly changing world, all of those themes are even more pronounced today than they were back then.
It's like they tapped into something fundamental about the human experience in the digital age, something that transcends any specific time or place.
Yeah, definitely. And the way they conveyed those feelings through music is just masterful. They weren't afraid to experiment, to
Mhm.
push the boundaries of what a pop song could be.
So let's talk about some specific tracks. Idiotheque has always been a standout for me. That frantic beat, the distorted vocals, the sense of impending doom. It's such a powerful song.
Oh yeah, Idiotic is a great example of how Radiohead used electronic music to create a feeling of unease and anxiety.
Yeah.
It's built around the sample from a 1970s electronic music piece, which gives it this disorienting, otherworldly quality.
And the lyrics with lines like, Ice Age coming, throw it in the fire,
Yeah.
tap into these fears about climate change and societal collapse that were starting to emerge in the early 2000s.
Right, and it's interesting because those fears are even more prevalent today,
Yeah.
making Idiotic feel almost eerily prophetic.
Another track that always gets to me is How to Disappear Completely. It's such a beautiful, haunting song with that delicate piano melody and York's fragile vocals.
How to Disappear Completely is almost like the emotional core of the album, you know?
Yeah.
It's a moment of vulnerability amidst all the chaos and noise.
And that use of the Ondi's Martinot, that eerie theremin-like instrument,
Yes.
adds such a haunting quality to the song.
It's like a voice from another world speaking to the anxieties and uncertainties of our own world.
It is. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Kid A, I'm curious, what are your final thoughts on this album and its enduring legacy?
You know, I think Kid A is a testament to the power of art to challenge us, to make us uncomfortable, and to help us make sense of the world around us. It's an album that continues to reveal new layers of meaning with each listen,
Yeah.
and its message feels more urgent now than ever before.
It's a reminder that great art isn't always easy or comfortable. Sometimes it's about confronting the difficult truths of our time, even if that means pushing boundaries and challenging expectations.
Right. Kid A did all of that. It pushed the boundaries of music, challenged our expectations of what a pop album could be, and confronted the anxieties of a generation on the brink of a new millennium.
And in doing so, it created something truly timeless, an album that continues to speak to us across the decades, reminding us that even in the face of uncertainty and change, there's always room for beauty, for innovation, and for hope.
Absolutely. And that's a pretty powerful message to leave our listeners with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Radiohead's Kid A.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep listening.